Good afternoon and welcome. For members who have not joined a previous IIEA webinar, we wish you and your best, and yours the best in getting through this most difficult of times. It's our great pleasure today to welcome Tom Wright, a leading Irish expert and expert in international affairs at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He is director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy at that institution. He's also a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and I very much recommend his most recent essay in that publication. His most recent book, All Measures Short of War, The Contest for the 21st Century and the Future of American Power, was published by Yale University Press in May 2017. At this moment of unprecedented uncertainty, Tom will talk today about the United States, its politics, and its place in the world. And he will take questions on these issues and many others, no doubt, during the Q&A, which will be on the record. Before we get going, let me remind you that we will be live tweeting this event at the handle @IIEA. So please feel free to join in. So with that, thank you, Tom, and over to you.
Great, Dan, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone at the Institute for having me back. I didn't anticipate the next time I'll be back, it will be from my house over a laptop virtually, but those are the times we're in, so it's a great pleasure to be here, albeit under difficult circumstances for everyone. So I thought what I would do is talk for about 20 minutes or so, about half on what's going on in the United States on this, particularly politically and economically, and then half on sort of the foreign policy, international order questions. I'm sure everyone's fairly sort of familiar, with the general trajectory of this over here, but I would just make a few sort of points starting out. I mean, I think what's really struck everyone is we spent the last 3 years saying, President Trump, has his faults and there's lots of problems in the administration, but there hasn't been a crisis yet. And as long as there's not a crisis, maybe we'll be able to muddle through in some way, right? That all of the daily drama and sort of craziness that you see on your TV screen or on your Twitter feed may not matter that much if the economy is going pretty well, and if there's sort of, generally the US is not involved in a major conflict or there's not a major crisis. Well, we now have the crisis, and it's not just any old crisis. It's probably the most sort of complex, difficult crisis that any government will be faced with. It's a health crisis first and foremost, but also economic, international, all wrapped into one. And I think it's hard to imagine a crisis that will be less suited to this administration, right? And it's not just the president. And it's also a very difficult crisis, I think, for the country as well, for reasons I will get into in a second. But in terms of the administration, they had really not sort of anticipated, I think, a global sort of pandemic, even though there was intelligence warnings on it from probably around December of 2019. John Bolton had dismantled the unit that was set up after the Ebola virus in 5 or 6 years ago. He dismantled that unit in the White House and dispersed it to the agencies. And the reason really was that he did not believe that that sort of health policy had a core place in the national security infrastructure. He saw that as something more for development or for the CDC, and it just wasn't in that normal sort of framework. And that was separate to sort of the president's sort of activities. Now, there were some people in the White House, I think, who were sort of worried about this, more the folks who sort of look at it from the China side of it. But Trump himself, I think, was worried more about the economic impact early on, and as we now sort of famously or infamously know, downplayed it throughout. And I think he did undertake the travel bans on China, which is a partial ban near the end of January. 40,000 people still came in after that, as the New York Times showed over the weekend, and there was later sort of a travel ban to Europe, but that was really as the crisis was really coming, was resulting in restrictions in travel everywhere, and not many people were traveling at that point. But aside from those measures, he didn't use that time to build capacity to really rally the states or rally the international community. And it wasn't only until late sort of mid-March that we saw this sort of turnaround, and now we have the daily press conferences where he's sort of saying he's leaning into it, but he's still perhaps more restrained in the use of executive authority than any other president would be. A lot of attention here is focused on the Defense Production Act, which is this piece of legislation that gives the president the right basically to command industry to undertake certain production lines if it's in the national interest. It's usually envisaged for a time of war, of conflict, but it's applicable here. He only very recently invoked that, and so that's sort of one of the leading examples of just how they've been sort of behind on this. But I think it's fair to say it's not just the president either. We have a federal system, obviously in the US, which gives a lot of power to governors, which means it's very hard to actually have a unified approach across the country. A president could call for a nationwide stay-at-home order, that he has not done that, so it's up to the individual states. The silver lining, I think, is that the federal system actually means that some governors can be more proactive than the president, right? So that probably wasn't really imagined sort of 3 or 4 years ago. If people were wargaming a pandemic scenario, they'd be assuming that the states were sort of laggards behind the White House. But in this case, New York, California, Washington, many others have been out ahead. Others have been significantly behind, Florida being the most significant of those. So it's a bit of a patchwork effort. We in Washington have sort of a stay-at-home order, but it's more lax, I think, than what you have in Ireland. And there's fewer restrictions. There's no sort of limitations, for instance, on exercise or how far you go from your house or the number of times you go to the grocery store. So that sort of partial lockdown may contribute, I think, across the country to these sort of extraordinary sort of infection numbers and death numbers that we are seeing now. The economic side is sort of interesting. I'll just spend a moment on that. I'm sort of struck by the contrast with 2008, where there's basically universal support for massive stimulus packages. And the reason is that nobody believes that the people who've lost their jobs here were to blame for the crisis. You see some of the more austerity-focused people on Capitol Hill say, well, look, the banks in 2008 were responsible, we shouldn't have bailed them out. But the restaurant sector, retail, entertainment, and they had no sort of control over this. And so a lot of the concerns about moral hazard or debt and sort of long-term viability of the debt are not really operable here. And so senators like Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, other sort of very conservative types have been basically along similar lines to the Democrats in the numbers. Now, there are significant differences in some of the details, particularly with regard to the conditions that are attached to some of the aid. But for the most part, there's broad support for massive stimulus packages. And what we saw a couple of weeks ago will not be by any means sort of the last word in it. We're expecting several sort of more, I think, over the duration of this. And the numbers, as in Europe, are very bleak. We think we're at 13% unemployment now. That should go up to about 20% probably at peak. Goldman Sachs, I think, estimate that even if there's a partial recovery, we'll be at 9% by the election. So this, I think, will be a very severe recession, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Just on the politics of this, President Trump got a bump. That's pretty normal for a president at a time of crisis. President George W. Bush's approval ratings after 9/11 were extremely high, I think over 75 or 80%. George H.W. Bush, at the time of the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, over 90%. Presidents tend to do pretty well in a crisis, but those numbers can ebb away pretty fast. What was striking to me was that President Trump's bump was actually pretty small, right? So he had 60% approval on the handling of the crisis. That's now gone down to less than 50%. And his overall approval rating was at 49%, which was high for him, but still pretty low. And that's declined a bit. So I think he's actually going to face quite a challenge if this crisis continues, as I think it will, through the election if unemployment remains high, and if there's sort of concerns about his missteps or how he's handling it. So I think he's in sort of a difficult political spot, even if the temporary numbers are positive. Joe Biden has been fairly out of the picture. Again, that's not very surprising, right? Because in the middle or at the beginning of the crisis, all of the attention is on the White House and the administration and that bully pulpit that the president has. But I think over the summer, we will see sort of Biden come in more in the media and campaigning. Quite what that campaigning looks like, I think is a huge question. No one quite knows the answer to. There's conventions scheduled for the end of August, but it's widely believed they may be cancelled. Obviously, mass rallies are probably very unlikely. President Trump would be very disappointed by that, of course. But it imposes real limitations on Biden too. So I think it will be a very unusual election campaign. A lot of the real concern is on the election itself. And some of you may have seen yesterday where voters in Wisconsin went to the polls in the middle of a pandemic. It was highly controversial, an opinion from a court that mandated the election when a lot of people wanted to postpone it. And so attention is naturally focused on the November election. Can that be cancelled? Can you have mail-in voting? What will we do if there's another outbreak then? And this is really sort of uncharted territory. You know, the Constitution wasn't written with a view to having an election during a pandemic. Democrats want to have mail-in ballots, which are fairly common here, but not universally applied across the states. Trump is opposed to that, largely because Republicans sort of believe that that sort of results in higher votes from Democratic voters, and he's sort of made that clear in press conferences. So we don't really know what an election would be like if people can't go to the polls. One question people often have is, can Trump postpone the election? He can't. It has to be an act of Congress to postpone the election, so Nancy Pelosi would need to agree. But even if they postpone the election, the inauguration date is set in the Constitution. So one way or the other, President Trump's term expires in January 2021, right? And if there is no election or there is no successor, then he still leaves office, actually, and then it goes into the line of succession. So Pence and him, their terms automatically end on January 20th. This is the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. So he does not have many sort of cards to play in terms of trying to, stay in power, use this to avoid the election altogether. But the worst case scenario is probably an election that partially goes off. Some states having it one way, other states saying they can't have an election, so they're just going to send electors to the Electoral College, which they're entitled to do because the Constitution says that only state legislators have to do this, and then the state legislators choose to empower that to the people. So this could easily end up in the courts, and it could be very messy, but it's not sort of a simple question of Trump just deciding to postpone it or cancel it and try to stay in power. So it will be, I think, a very difficult period, and Democrats are trying to use this next stimulus package to attach conditions that would ensure sort of a free and open sort of election by mail-in ballots or other mechanisms, and that will be a big fight in the coming weeks. So just turning to the international picture, Dan kindly mentioned this piece I had in the Atlantic a few days ago, and really that piece was trying to ask what happens if this crisis goes on for 12 or 18 months, right? We believe from a lot of our leaders that our leaders seem to believe that it could be over in the summer, that if we have this pain up front and that then it will be under control and then it will be sort of back to normal in some way. I certainly agree that I don't think we'll see the level of shutdown that we have until there's a vaccine, but it seems pretty clear from the health experts and that we won't have a return of normal until there is a vaccine or until there is herd immunity achieved across the world, or at least in some major countries, and that will take 12 to 18 months. So for the next year, probably up until June, July of 2021, assuming that that's when a vaccine comes to the market, there will be significant changes to our lives and to the economy. And I think that will have a major sort of impact on the world sort of going forward. And the first sort of piece of that I'd like to mention is on cooperation, because this is really the first crisis that the US has been completely absent as a global leader and has had really zero interest in coordinating cooperation between its allies or between other countries. If you look at 2008-09, the initial shock of that financial crisis was worse than the shock in 1929 to 33. So the first 12 months were a bigger drop, but then it eased off and it returned to more positive ground and much better than the 1929 to 33 crisis, because many experts believe, and I don't know if Dan agrees with this or not, but one hypothesis is that it was the international response, right? That the cooperation between countries, the enlightened steps that they took, meant that it was not a depression, right? But it wasn't the initial shock that was lesser than shocks of previous eras. Well, in this case, the shock is incredibly bad, but the response is even worse, right? And so there's been virtually no cooperation at the G20 or G7 level. And it's not just Trump. I mean, I think he's the main culprit. He doesn't believe in it, but every other leader, with the possible exception of Emmanuel Macron, basically are focused on their domestic crises, because that's sort of the most challenging problem that they have in this sort of current moment. And we haven't really seen countries sort of working together. We've seen these export controls over medical supplies, not just in the US, but in Europe as well, and in other parts of the world. And I think as we go forward, international cooperation will become more important, not less important. So there's a case to be made, and I sort of made this in the article, that although it's a bad thing at the moment, leaders should be focused on their domestic issues, right? They should also be looking at it internationally, but international is a smaller piece of this solution currently, but in the future it will be quite a major piece. So think about, how do you actually scale up in the vaccine and ensure that it gets to all of the places it needs to get to? How do we ensure that countries that are unable to cope with this crisis in the developing world, or in particularly weak states with fragile health systems, that there can be support on a coordinated basis internationally to prevent any boomerang effect, whereby if we get rid of it in our own countries, then it comes back to us from those countries, and just to help out those countries too, because they're in a difficult position. How do we ensure that as we rebuild our economies, we do so in a mutually beneficial way and not in a zero-sum sort of beggar thy neighbor way? So how do we look at learning lessons from this to create better international institutions and surveillance mechanisms that can prevent future pandemics, because this almost surely will not be the last one in our lifetimes. So I think those are the type of things that require international cooperation. And I think if Trump is re-elected, it will make that cooperation extremely unlikely. And so we may go out of that sort of period in 2021 with a much more sort of nationalistic, inwardly focused sort of approach to this, which I think will be tragic and very sort of damaging in the long term. But I think that, and I don't know if the international order would really, as we know it in terms of institutions and multilateralism, would survive that shock in 2021. I think it can survive what's going on this month and over the next few months. Another sort of concern that people have, which is sort of linked to the cooperation side, is US-China relations, right? China obviously made a lot of missteps in this early on, knew about it from sort of November of 2019, sort of suppressed information about it, suppressed the experts who were warning, imposed sort of partial travel bans for travel in China, but not to the rest of the world, pressured the WHO. So there's a lot of anger, I would say, here and elsewhere, where in terms of China's response to that. But there's also widespread recognition that we need to cooperate with China, even if we disagree with how they handled it, and even if we're competing with them in other areas. There was a letter a few days ago by 100 sort of foreign policy people, including Madeleine Albright, Steve Hadley, and others, calling for exactly this, that I signed on to as well, but calling for cooperation with China. And what was interesting about that is you had a mixture of hawks who are quite competitive toward China, and people who also favor more sort of engagement, but they recognize that superpowers or great powers need to cooperate on global health. And there's a precedent for that. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States cooperated in eliminating smallpox at the height of the Cold War, and also cooperated in non-proliferation and other issues. And we've been unable to do that so far with China. And I think that is something that will become particularly important in 2021 as well. At the moment, I think there's a lot of there's some sort of toying. We've seen some opening between Trump and Xi after the phone call a couple of weeks ago, and we'll see where that goes. And one thing that I know is of interest to a lot of you as well is sort of globalization and supply chains and sort of the lessons that will be drawn afterwards. I would say I think there is a widespread belief across the political spectrum here that it's sort of unacceptable that the US would find itself without any capacity to manufacture and scale up quickly on crucial medical supplies for a pandemic that was widely sort of predicted, right? And so the lack of ventilators, the fact that the US is needing to find those in China or find face masks in China, concern about other critical pharmaceuticals. I mean, there will be an investigation probably along the lines of the 9/11 Commission. Once this is over or nearly over, they will draw sort of major policy conclusions and recommendations, and those are likely to be implemented. And I find it very hard to believe that a part of that will not be to ensure that the US does not get caught out again on that. And I'm sure other countries will have a similar approach. The question is, what is the solution, right? Is the solution to be more sort of isolationist, self-sufficient, pull back from global trade, impose these very severe restrictions on companies, or is it to have more redundancy in the system? So even if it's a little bit economically inefficient, you're sort of buying insurance against this happening again, and you put in place regulations that require companies to sort of double up, or you have sort of trusted partners of like-minded countries that make ironclad commitments to share this at a time of crisis. So I think there's different sort of approaches coming out of it, but I think one thing we will not see is just a return to the status quo, because too many people have had their lives disrupted from this. I think the same is true, by the way, of the EU. I think it's highly likely that Macron and others say that the EU will need a greater sort of internal capacity. But the EU, I think, is even better off than the US in this. I mean, it's just been really dramatic. And part of the problems here could be dealt with by the Defense Production Act, but part of them are separate to that. There's just been a real sort of problem in getting companies that want to actually produce some of this equipment to be able to do it, given the manufacturing plants that they actually have, which are sort of out of sync with what the requirements are. I just say a couple of other very brief things just on the World Health Organization that's gotten a lot of sort of attention over the last 24 hours because of Trump's announcement that he will consider stopping funding. They're in a tough spot. It's very difficult for an international institution to operate in an environment where the major sort of powers have a lot of vested interest and are very sensitive to criticism. And I do sort of empathize in some way that they wouldn't want to sort of aggravate China early on, but at the same time, they gave advice that seemed to be at odds with what's happening at that particular moment in terms of human transmission, praising the Chinese response and advising against travel bans to buy time, which had a big impact in small countries in particular. In Asia, may have contributed to the problem in Europe. And I think there will be a real sort of reflection on this afterwards. And my main sort of takeaway is that sort of liberal democratic countries need to work together more in these international institutions and engage more to ensure that China or other countries, have a fair say and a legitimate say, but don't sort of distort the objective analysis of those institutions, because we really need a World Health Organization that works effectively and efficiently. And then I guess, Dan, I'm just out of time, I think, but the very final point is just on the Middle East, which gets sort of neglected on this, and maybe Africa as well. I'm very worried by how this is affecting the Middle East. I think it really has ravaged Iran. I think Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt are particularly vulnerable. Egypt in particular is a country with, I think, very limited sort of capacity to deal with this in a health perspective. There's some signs that it's already gotten into the regime and all throughout Egyptian society. And I think we may see the hollowing out of a lot of these already weak and fragile governments in the Middle East. And I worry too, it hasn't really had a major impact in Africa yet, but I think we also can sort of see there that there's limited capacity as well. And social distancing, as many people have pointed out, is in some ways a privilege rather than, you know, something that everyone can do. A lot of people don't have that option. And so if this disease takes the path that we've known it to take, I think the consequences could be devastating. And that just brings me back to the earlier point. It just underscores the importance of international cooperation and of leadership from Europe and the US and others on this, to ensure that once we get past the immediate sort of domestic crises, that we also work together to provide unprecedented aid and assistance to these other countries that are unable to do it for themselves. So Dan, with that, I'll stop there and look forward to our conversation.
Many thanks, Tom, and always a pleasure to get your big picture view on things. People would like to ask questions. You'll see down at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function. If you could write your question in there with your name and your affiliation, that would be great. On the developing worlds, let me just tell members that our Director of Research, Jill Donoghue, is working very hard on our focus on the developing world. And one of the events we'll be running over the coming weeks will be looking at the effects of the pandemic on the developing world. Tom, if I could kick off with a sort of shared question with Porrick Murphy as the chair of our geopolitics group. You mentioned the absence, this is the first major global crisis without American leadership. Just wondering if there's any behind the scenes things going on. The State Department, for example, which you'd be familiar with. I'd be a little bit more positive in terms of central banking cooperation. The Federal Reserve is working closely with the other big central banks. And frankly, in the economic response at this point, the only institutions that really, really matter in just addressing the immediate shock are central banks, for central banks to open the taps and be lenders of last resort, both within their own countries and amongst each other, so that the currencies can be, you don't get a blockage in the currency system. So the Federal Reserve has been doing that. Porrick Murphy specifically wonders if the US could exploit its reserve currency status in some way during this crisis. Now, I know economics is not your full specialization, but if you have any thoughts on that and the prospects of let's say, White House cooperation with other countries at State Department level, etc.
Yeah, no, great question. So, so the good news first, I think you're right. I mean, we do see at the agency level sort of that network cooperation between the US and other countries, right? So the Fed, I think, is playing a very constructive role, as it did in 2008-09. Federal Reserve is, of course, independent from the White House, and the chair of the Federal Reserve has clashed a lot, or Trump has clashed a lot with the chair of the Federal Reserve over the last couple of years. So that has continued. The CDC, I think, as well, and other sort of agencies in the US government have maybe slightly reduced from before, but still have a significant footprint around the world. And I think they are working, I'm told, pretty sort of efficiently and effectively with their partners and with other countries, the exception being China, where the CDC's sort of footprint had basically been ended by the Trump administration under fairly sort of controversial circumstances over the last couple of years, that they've had less engagement there. But I think generally speaking, we've seen the CDC and other sort of major agencies remain engaged. The higher up you go, the worse it gets though, right? So Pompeo has really been completely absent as far as we can tell. There's been quite a few sort of articles on him in the last week, in particular, sort of calling attention to this, that he's not actually on the phones trying to rally the world or think about what comes next, or looking for ways that the US can lead on this, or trying to bring together the G20 or G7. There was a G7 call, but actually it was suggested by Macron. Macron did all the work and he let Trump chair it, and then he did all the follow-up, right? So, and Trump let it be known that he wasn't really that into it, that he would have sort of preferred not to do it. So it was a positive call, I think, and it worked out reasonably well, but it was just a sign of how the US wasn't all that engaged. In terms of the question on the reserve currency, I think that's a very sort of interesting one. I think it's unlikely, because I think when you look at the key players, whether it's, you know, the Fed or whether it's the Treasury Department, like Steve Mnuchin, for all of his faults, is actually pretty multilaterally minded in terms of international economic cooperation and coordination. Maybe not at the institutional level, sort of IMF, World Bank, but he tends to be more mainstream in these debates from what we know compared to somebody like Peter Navarro, right? And Mnuchin, I think, still is a significant figure in all of this, and he's been pretty constructive actually on the domestic side of the stimulus negotiations. Trump isn't on speaking terms with Pelosi, but Mnuchin's done a lot of the heavy lifting there. I've been fairly critical of him before, so I've been sort of pleasantly surprised by some of the things he's done here. And then the other sort of, just if you're looking at the internal sort of dynamics of it, the other little nuance is just within the National Security Council. There are people in there, I think, who are fairly sort of engaged and inclined to cooperate, particularly with allies, maybe not so much with China. The Deputy National Security Advisor and some others have been fairly sort of consistent on that. But the problem is, of course, the president, because he's so engaged every day in the press conferences, that there's frequently a big gap between what he comes out and says and what his team is saying or positioning for.
Forgive me there, the making mistakes with technology. Two questions from two of our members. One from Noel Fahy, who was ambassador to the US, Ireland's ambassador to the US. He's wondering about India, whether you've thoughts on India, whether you've been in contact with colleagues in India on what's happening there. Noel Hallahan has a question, another Institute member has a question on domestic politics. If there's a high level of deaths in the US, in particular, what impact that could have on swing states?
Yeah, so on India, I'm very worried about India. I think because of the social distancing problem, right? It's almost impossible to imagine, you know, Modi being able to implement sort of an effective social distancing model in India. I think it's, you know, there's been some speculation that maybe COVID-19 might abate as it gets warmer. It's definitely getting warmer in India at the moment, but there's very little sign that will happen, right? And so I don't think they'll necessarily be saved by the summer in this. There is quite a lot of, you know, evidence so far that it can, you know, it may be maybe less severe in the summer, but it still persists. And so I think India could be in for a real sort of challenge and problem. And I think that sort of gets to the point about international cooperation. You know, I think India should be, along with some other countries, should be sort of Pompeo's sort of top priority list, and trying to ensure that everything can be done to help, because ultimately we're all only really as strong as our weakest link on this, which is not to say that that's India, but I think it is by far sort of the largest, most significant country that seems to have a real sort of problem in terms of its capacity to deal with it, just because of the because of the structure of the country. In terms of the election here, yeah, and I just read the question there in the Q&A, and it was sort of if there are lower deaths than the 240,000 that President Trump has said, would it help him in the swing states? You know, I think he will say that. He will say if it's anything less than that, that he succeeded. I don't really think people will buy it, but I think one thing you have to look at, though, is that's sort of interesting, is the granular detail in the state. So let's take a state like Florida. Florida is run by Governor DeSantis there. He implemented changes to the unemployment scheme several years ago, whereby he basically made it impossible for you to apply for unemployment benefit, right? And he did it because he wanted to keep the numbers low. So for instance, to get unemployment benefit in Florida, you need to prove that you've talked to 5 potential employers in the last week, right? So 1 a day about a job to be able to get that unemployment benefit. You have to apply online, not in person, and the website is sort of underfunded and frequently crashes, right? They set this up because unemployment was very low and they didn't want anyone to be tempted to go onto it. But what that means now is that basically you have an unemployment system that's completely inadequate for the scale of this crisis that is hit. And you've hundreds of thousands of Floridians, many of whom probably voted for President Trump, right, who can't get the assistance that they're entitled to under the national stimulus plan and the extension of unemployment protection, because as you know here, obviously the safety net is much worse than it is in Europe. That is already shaping up to be a huge political problem for Republicans in Florida. And I just think that if this continues, and again, I think it will, and that these economic problems will be very sort of significant and persistent, and there will be a real sort of reaction against sort of the holes in the safety net and the problems that the federal government has in helping people, because this is not a normal sort of unemployment crisis, right? This is a cliff that was imposed by the federal government for health reasons. Some of the other states, you know, Governor Whitmer in Michigan is sort of emerging as a contender for the vice presidential nomination for Joe Biden. She's been fairly impressive so far, so that could have a bit of an impact there. So I guess my answer is that I think, you know, Trump will definitely engage in this overall effort to say he's, you know, had the greatest response ever. I think Democrats will sort of point out that he made all of these massive mistakes and it didn't need to be this way, and that if you compare it to Ebola or H1N1, that the consequence and cost being amongst the worst of any major advanced sort of industrialized country is really outrageous, and that debate will take place. But there's also these state level dynamics, I think, that will work against him. And I think Biden is actually pretty well positioned to take advantage of that. Biden's very popular in Florida, for instance, you know, and he's quite strong, obviously, in the Midwest as well.
Good, thanks, Tom. So a question from Magella OD asking what prospects are there of a federally mandated shutdown, that the president would override all of the states and demand a shutdown. Bill Emmett, also a member, former editor-in-chief of The Economist, asks, bipartisanship on China. Do you think that will be strong after this and strongly hostile, or at least strong vis-a-vis China? And he asks a second question. People have often speculated as to what might induce senior Republicans to break with Trump. Do you see any signs that this could finally happen over the pandemic?
Yeah, so in answer to the first one, I think there's virtually no chance of a national stay-at-home order, even though he should do that, because he hasn't done it yet, because I think his instincts are still to reopen the economy. He wants to deflect responsibility to the governors, that he wants to be able to say, well, I didn't close your economies, the governors did. And I think if there is appetite from certain states to reopen the economy, that will push on an open door with Trump, right? So I think that that is something he should definitely do, and it's something Fauci, I think, wants him to do. I just think there's very little likelihood that he will actually do it. In terms of major Republicans breaking, I don't expect that to happen either. I mean, they, you know, if you look just as an example, the other day with this naval issue, with the Secretary of the Navy, Motley, criticizing this commander of an aircraft carrier who sent a letter because the disease was infecting his crew, and then he was fired by Motley, and there was virtually nothing about him at all from senior Republicans. And then Motley, after Trump criticized him at a press conference, or implicitly criticized him, and then the Secretary of Defense asked him to resign, then all of a sudden, all these Republicans in Capitol Hill started to criticize Motley, the Secretary of the Navy, for how he handled Crozier, right? And what that tells me is that they have no desire to say anything critical of the administration until they have a permission slip to do so, right? And so if Trump says it's okay, they'll do it. Otherwise, I think they're just hunkering down. So I don't see any major change in that pattern there. On China, look, yeah, I think there is a bipartisan approach. I mean, there's very little trust in the Chinese leadership on this issue. There's a lot of frustration with how they handled it, acknowledging that the US made mistakes too domestically, but I think there's a lot of frustration and anger even with how China handled it. But for the most part, I think people recognize that you need some cooperation with China, and there's a real frustration with the administration until recently to be spending most of their time trying to think about what to call COVID-19 and to try to, call it the Chinese virus, which had all these ethnic and sort of racist issues with it, and really was at best a massive sort of distraction from the need to actually have some coordination with Beijing, right? So I think that for the most part, I'd say the foreign policy people in both parties see it that way. There are some sort of dissenters. So Tom Cotton, from Arkansas, I think has been someone who's calling for punishing China after this. I'm not sure that will go anywhere, but I think there will be generally a shift toward a more skeptical, competitive approach, in that no one's really going to say, look, Xi Jinping is operating in good faith and he should be our main partner in this and we can work together. What they will say is we can't really trust him. We can't trust what's coming out, so we need to try to verify it by ourselves, but we still need mutual interest-based cooperation and to bring China in to that sort of solution, because you can't have an approach to pandemics or climate change that doesn't include China.
Thanks, Tom. So 3 sort of linked up questions. Ellen Hazelcorn asks, do you think the Democrats will now rally around Biden? Peter Gunning asks, is there reason for, or more puts it, that surely there's reason for optimism if there's a change of president in November or January in terms of international cooperation and multilateralism? And the third one from Fergal Mython from the Department of Foreign Affairs, let me just read it. Under the 20th Amendment, who chooses the new president if there is no election? The Senate, the House, or combined choice of both houses?
That last one's a particularly tough one. I don't know the answer to the last one. Actually, I've been trying to find it out. I think there's no real planning for no election. And also it's up to each individual state how they conduct a federal election. So you could imagine a situation where, some states don't have a popular election, but vote even remotely in their legislators to send electors, and then you have other states that have popular votes, and there's a question mark about the legitimacy of the election overall. I think it's not, again, it's not really within the power of, the administration to, to just not have the election or to unilaterally postpone it or cancel it. But let's say that there isn't actually sort of a legitimate election because the pandemic is maybe as bad then as it is now. Then I think it's just really actually a simple matter of the line of succession, right? So, Trump and Pence are no longer president on January 20th. The House and the Senate will not have sent in sort of the president-elect, right? There's a process for that where the Electoral College meets and then it's ratified by Congress. So that will not happen. So then in default, it will go to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. If for some reason she's not, elected, then it would go to the next person, the President pro tem and down. But it would, probably go no more than 4th in terms of the President pro tem who will be there, which is sort of ironically the oldest person in the Senate in the majority party. So I think it's pretty, it's a drama set for sort of a West Wing episode or House of Cards. I think in some way we don't really know that much about it, but I suspect there'll be a lot more attention. But I do think the election will happen, but I think it could end up in the courts in terms of the mechanism of it. On Biden, yeah, I think, you do see that already. I mean, Democrats are rallying around Biden. The only thing that hasn't happened yet is Sanders hasn't dropped out, but for all intents and purposes, he is the designate nominee. There's a big question mark around the convention. I think it's unlikely probably the convention happens. They've already postponed it by a month, but it can take place virtually. Once that happens, he's officially the nominee. But I think, he is widely seen now as the actual sort of, nominee-elect, as it were. And then the other, Dan, what was the middle question?
Peter Gunning asked about or posed the idea that a change of president will surely lead to more and better international cooperation.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And I think it's, all of Biden's instincts on this are to do it internationally and cooperatively. I have hopefully have a piece coming out on this exact topic actually in the next few days, which I'll share with you once it publishes. But I think the other reason to be optimistic about Biden, if he were to win, is, as I mentioned earlier, the need and demand for international cooperation will be greater in 21 than it is today, right? So most of the heavy lifting on the multilateral front shouldn't take place at the moment, right? It will take place in 6 or 8 months in terms of, planning for after the crisis, putting in place new institutions, ensuring that the economic rebuild is coordinated, helping out developing countries that are still struggling. So all of these questions, I think, will be for the next president. So we're sort of a little bit lucky in that regard. But of course, the flip side of it is if Trump is reelected, then I think we will see a real hemorrhaging of the international order. And I would just sort of point out that it's interesting, my understanding of it is that other leaders like Macron and Merkel, initially they were petrified of Trump, then they thought they could deal with him and muddle through. Now they're back to being petrified, right? Because they realize what it's like to have a leader of a major ally that has zero interest in working with them and is actually pretty difficult and doing things that are counterproductive. And I think that will actually be worse even next year than it is this year.
Okay. Mari Cross, a board member at the Institute, asks, do you think that Iran will be weakened by this epidemic to an extent that politics in the Middle East has changed? And David Kelly of Purdue asks, I can bring that up. Well, let's go with that one, and I'll get to it.
Look, I think this has really affected Iran very badly and very early. It seems like the city of Qom, with this religious festival, that the COVID-19 got out and affected a significant number of people in the regime. There was those extraordinary videos early on of, the health minister saying there's no problem while he was coughing and sick. And then the next day he was diagnosed with COVID-19, and senior members of the establishment have died from it already, and maybe a lot more than we know of. So I think it is, it is they're very fragile. I think what's been happening here in terms of reinforcing sanctions is unfortunate, because even if you're very critical of the regime, I think it's important that the Iranian people can deal with this sort of effectively. And again, we're only as strong as our weakest link ultimately on this. So all countries should be helped to deal with this pandemic. And I think we do need to take a tough look at that and tough look at sanctions and suspend them temporarily perhaps, and try to get more international assistance into Iran to help them deal with this. But I think not because of the regime, but because it's affecting sort of the Iranian people. Whether it leads to a change, I've been asking a lot of my colleagues this who work in the Middle East, and what they basically say is that it won't, because, at least not in the short term, because there's no organized opposition in these countries, include Egypt in that. What you'll see is just a collapse in capacity and a collapse in governance, and maybe the emergence of zombie governments that aren't really able to deal with the problems that are affecting their societies. But it will be so severe that there really won't be space for normal sort of politics, right? There's no mechanism by which now, if a leader were to, if the Ayatollah were to get this, or, Sisi, were to get it, obviously there would be a change, but no one knows what that change would be. It would more likely be somebody from within the regime than sort of a change of regime. I think overall, does it affect the power balance in the Middle East? I think it weakens all of the Arab states and Iran. It weakens all of them. I think Israel is a separate, case here. It's a very separate society and deals with this more akin maybe to a European country or to the US or Canada. But I think it's very bad news for the Middle East overall.
David Kelly's question, what lasting impact could the COVID-19 crisis have on state versus federal authority? How united will the United States be after the crisis? And the Director General here at the Institute, Michael Collins, asks you, how would you evaluate how the media the US has dealt with the pandemic and the crisis?
Yeah, so I think that it depends partly on the election, right? I think if Trump is defeated, I think you'll probably see a pretty unified approach because everyone recognized huge mistakes were made. There needs to be a real accounting for what happened. There will be a look at a stronger federal authority the next time and more redundancy within the system and a set of protocols to follow. If Trump is re-elected, on the other hand, I can imagine him being very defensive about it and saying he didn't do anything wrong, so everything's absolutely perfect, so no need to do anything different, and he'd probably oppose a commission to look into it. But I think assuming that it's Biden, just for the sake of the question, I think we will see major changes. I think each individual state will have to improve their protocols in response to it. But I think also we'll see a call for a much stronger federal response the next time. So as federal stay-at-home order, federal supplies of PPE and other critical medical supplies, rather than saying to the states, like, you guys go do it, and if you get stuck, let us know and we'll see what we can do. So I think there'll be a lot sort of there. On Michael's question on the media, I think the media has actually handled it reasonably well. I mean, there's been some extraordinary reporting on it, particularly from the Times and the Post and some others, just revealing details about the original outbreak, and then some of the failures here in the US in the response, and some of the stories in Europe. I think some of that reporting has really been extraordinary, and they were on it early, from sort of late January on. And so I think they really sort of did pretty well. In terms of the broadcast media, obviously Fox, I think, has really failed on this because it was part of this echo chamber saying it wasn't really anything different than the flu. But I think for the most part, cable has been reasonably, cable is never sort of great and Socratic and Jeffersonian about this, but I don't think it sort of made the problem much worse than it needed to be. So I think the media did okay, but I think the print media in particular have just been sort of extraordinary on it.
Okay, good. Nora Owen, amongst other things, a former minister, asks, do you have any insights into reports around Biden's health? I haven't heard that, but I'm sure you're closer to these things.
I think I think there's, I think he's doing well. I mean, I'm not totally sure about the rumors, reports she's referring to, but overall, I mean, before this, there was questions about his age, and just his interview style and whether or not it was to do with this old stutter or it was something else. And I think that's sort of an ongoing, just political conversation here. But based on everything we know and based on his medical sort of records, he's in good health. I mean, he is sort of sequestered at home at the moment, like everyone else. And there's been a few challenges early on because his home actually isn't set up for broadcast or anything like that. So he did a couple of media speeches and other set piece events, and they're a bit like us here, just sort of speaking from your desk over Zoom. And so they've been working on that, I think, just from an image point of view. But I think we will see more of him, I think, in the next month or two. It's very hard to compete in the early stages of a crisis with the president who has an hour and a half long press conference every day. So I think his health is good. But look, I think for either Trump or Biden, COVID-19 is a big personal risk. They'll be out there, they'll be campaigning. If it was if it was a relative, you'd be saying, do not go out of the house for the next sort of 8 or 9 months, and don't be going out next October, November when it could be quite bad. Try to remove yourself from people. Biden is 78, 79, Trump is 74, so they are at risk. There's no doubt about that. But I don't really have any reason to think that they're sort of it's affected either of them sort of yet. Okay,
Conor Fagan from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade wonders what impact all this will have on cooperation, specifically on climate change, make it more difficult or more likely?
Yeah, I think you can sort of tell either story here. The positive story is it reminds us of these long-term risks and actually being prepared and working together. I certainly hope that's true. The other side of it is that the governments just are going to be completely preoccupied with COVID-19 and the aftermath for the next few years, because even if there's a vaccine and this is over, we're still dealing with the repercussions of it, right? In terms of economics, politics, institutionally preventing it from happening again. So if you look in Europe, for instance, at van der Leyen, I think she thought her commission presidency would be about climate change and the Green New Deal. Now I'm pretty sure she thinks and knows it's about COVID-19, right? And so I think you just see a shift in the emphasis and in the time that leaders are dedicating to this. So I don't think anyone's going to say climate change doesn't matter or we shouldn't really work on it. I think they'll continue to say those things, but the type of actions that we needed, I think we'll see some of them, but not maybe as many as we would have seen, had this not occurred. But I could sort of, I think you can make either deductive case at the moment. We don't really know where it's going to come down on.
Okay, last one or two. Tom Ferris, a life member here at the Institute, asks about the impact of the virus on the southern US states. And I suppose more generally, is there going to be a regional pattern? Will the poorer US states be hit further, or will federal funds ramp up to affect the most badly affected areas?
Yeah, look, there's no reason to think this is not going to affect all of the country, right? And the White House has said they are worried about hotspots in red states, as they're called politically. Louisiana, I think, is a particular concern. Florida is a coastal state, but maybe is separate. But, in rural areas, I think because there's not as much density of population, it's probably slower to spread, but only slower, not that it won't spread. And so I think it will affect the whole country, and I think they are worried about that. I think for the last few weeks, it's been easy in a way for Fox and some others to tell a story that this is more a city-based thing and you don't really need to worry about it in the rest of the country. But I think Fauci and others in the administration sort of understand that that's not the case. So I think that we will see that, I think, in the next month or so. And I do think Trump will, for obvious political reasons, be more responsive to some of those states, than he has been to New York or to Michigan or to Washington State. So I think that's sort of just an unfortunate reality about how this White House operates.
The very last one, Tom, from Tom Hennessy, again, the Department of Foreign Affairs, just picking up, I'm picking up on one of the quotes from your piece. You spoke to an EU official about how things would work out in Europe, and he told you that, quote, it would bring out the best and the worst in us, maybe both simultaneously. Tom Hennessy's question is about EU-US cooperation. Where do you see that going?
EU-US cooperation? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah, on the quote, I think it was interesting that they, I think they're worried about, the politics of this as it goes forward in Europe, right? That on Euro bonds, Corona bonds, sort of a common response, that right now, the feeling, there's a lot of sympathy, but over time, it may be more difficult, especially in Germany. And we've already seen that last night, with this rather difficult Eurogroup meeting. And so, ultimately, people tend to sort of hunker down into their national perspectives. And I think that's what that person was saying. In terms of US, EU, again, I think it comes back to the election. Trump has had this real bee in his bonnet about the EU. Biden, I think, is a very strong supporter of the EU, and you'll see a massive uptick in engagement with the EU if he wins in November. But I think that the real sort of question is, what is the substance of that? And I think that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the vaccine, in terms of a coordinated preparation for the next time, a real lessons learned, mechanism to try to figure out the failings everywhere over the last few months and presumably the next 6 to 8 months. So I think there's huge scope because, in the US, as I think a lot of people on the call know, when people think of Europe, they tend to think of NATO, and it's like, how do we work with NATO on this? But NATO has very little role on this. I mean, maybe a tiny bit, but there's no real capacity for health and pandemics in NATO. It's a little bit, but it's much more in the EU and at the national level. And so engaging on that now in the EU too, as you know, health is not really a core competency of the EU, right? So EU is not super strong in that either. But I think maybe to turn around one of the questions that someone else had earlier, there might need to be a reassessment of that after the fact in the same way that there would be in a state federal basis over here. But I think the US needs to engage with Europe at multiple levels on this next year.
Good. Tom, as ever, it's fantastic to get your views. Look forward to catching up in person when this is all over, or at least some sort of normality has been returned. So many thanks for joining us.
And thank you all of you. Thank you to everyone as well. And please all stay safe. And I look forward to being over with you in person at some point in the not too distant future.
Many thanks. Good. And everyone, all the members, thank you for joining, and thanks for your many questions. Just to flag, our next event next week will be with former Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta. Many interesting things to say about his country and the future of Europe. We look forward to welcoming you to that event. And in the meantime, very best to you and yours.